it can actually be hard to PM and design at the same time. You start to take shortcuts and you're like, well, I think I know this constraint, so I'm going to like declare it up front so that I don't kind of explore this whole solution space, or I don't let myself dream a little bit of what's possible because I already have a good sense of the trade-offs. You start to get very narrowed in very quickly. I kind of see a CEO as oftentimes sitting, taking in all these different inputs and figuring out what to do. And so I find it really hard to think that you can do that and design what's possible in the future.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
Hi, I'm Yuhki Yamashita.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
Welcome to today's show. Today we're going to discuss product design. What is it? How do you do it well? What's the difference between a product designer and a product manager? What are some of the core building blocks and tools product designers use? The limits of Agile and designing the ideal first, all with one of the best product managers, designers, and the chief product officer of the most important design tool in the world, Yuhki Yamashita. So stay tuned. All of that and much more on this week's show, right after the break.
Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance with SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Welcome back. Just before we jump in with Yuhki, we wanted to remind you all about the Startup Podcast Pact. If you listen to the Startup Podcast and get value from it, we ask you to help us spread the word by following us and reviewing us in your favorite listening app, subscribing to us on YouTube, and giving us a shout out on LinkedIn or wherever it is that you have your audience. It means the world to us. It helps more listeners find us and build their startups, and it allows us to keep doing what we're doing with amazing guests like Yuhki. So thanks so much. Now let's jump right in.
All right, on today's show, we are talking product design, and today we have Yuhki Yamashita as our guest co-host. He's the chief product officer at Figma right now, and he has a rich career spanning over a decade in the tech industry. He's made significant contributions to some of the world's leading tech companies. Before Figma, he was at Uber, where we got to work together just a little bit. He started off leading the rider experience team and then led the driver experience team, which I think was just a little bit after my time. And in both roles, he led complete redesigns of those apps. I myself was fortunate to witness him redesigning the rider app firsthand. And it was, Yuhki, I never really got to tell you this, but it was a breathtaking effort. The way you led through design thinking and through inspiration, aspiration, motivated, animated everybody around that mission and got everybody excited. It was really, really amazing to watch. Since we're going to do an episode about product design, what better than to get a product manager who believes in design and is working on one of the most important design tools in the world. So welcome to the show, Yuhki.
Thanks for having me, Chris. It's good to see you again. And yeah, thanks for all the kind words.
Let's start in a really, really rudimentary place. Firstly, let's talk about what the heck is product design. Maybe Yuhki, you can share, what would your definition be? How do you think about that topic and how would you define it for the audience?
Well, I think about design, generally speaking, in a more broad way than most people would think about it, which is just problem solving, right? And there's a problem to be solved and you're trying to figure out the best solution for it. And when we come to product design, it's really kind of focused specifically on, all right, when you're working on software, what are some of the biggest problems that your users are having? How do you solve them well? So I take an expansive definition just because I think if you don't do that, you start to limit yourself on how you solve the problem or what kind of problems that you go after. Yeah, I like to keep it broad.
And Yuhki, one of the things that I see very often, and I'm sure you do as well, is at many companies, the role of product design is reduced nearly to one of visual design, or if you're lucky, of a certain amount of interaction design. So I think it's fantastic that you
Yeah.
start broad. And, in a
Yeah.
very real sense, this is sort of the key activity of product building is designing that solution. I'd love to see design centered a lot more in so many of these processes and not just sort of used as nearly the sort of the lipstick on the pig visual design that I think is too often done.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's where the industry is headed too, in the sense of, when I was at Google way back when, I feel like we differentiated between interaction designers and visual designers and different kinds of disciplines. And, over time, there's an understanding that actually, you can't kind of silo these functions too much. And then maybe like last, I want to call it like 6 to 8 years, maybe like the emergence of this kind of more broader discipline called product design has emerged.
I do want to touch on some of those other terms just because I know they're in the water and people will call themselves these things. They'll mention them. And some of the founders listening just may not know some of the distinctions, even though a lot of design is collapsing under this heading of product design. But just for the purposes of completeness and definitions, in the tech startup world, some of the aspects of design you're going to bump into, some of the words you're going to bump into around design are like Marcom design or brand design. This is really about designing your brand and your marketing communications. And that generally fits outside of the definition of product design that we're talking about today. You'll hear the terms UX or user experience, which is generally about how the app works. They go from this screen to this screen to this screen, this state to this state. There's UI or user interface, which is generally what the app looks like, right? The pixels, the colors, the drop shadows, and the polish. I'm being very reductive here. I want to be clear. And then there's product design, which generally combines UI and UX to think through the problems, as you said, Yuki, to solve problems holistically, generally combining UI and UX to really think through how do we solve the problems the user might be experiencing at any given time in the journey and in the overall domain. Today, we really want to focus on that last one, product design, spanning UI, UX, solving problems, and what role does this play in your broader product journey and startup journey as you get started here. And Yaniv, you talked about ideally this is the tip of the spear, the top of the pyramid, the starting place. Guys, I'll tell you, I'm surprised by the number of companies I meet where they may not even have a product designer or certainly don't use them to initiate the process of solving problems. Have you seen that, Yuki? What's your how often do you see that? I mean, you may have some bias here since you're working at Figma, but, have you seen that in your career and, where's your head at about that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have a bias like through my lens and also sitting here in Silicon Valley, where I think that the importance of product design is starting to be really well understood. Certainly, you definitely see your companies who don't really think about product design too much, and that can show in your product. And that's not to say that like, every problem that needs solving ever requires all the capabilities of a product designer per se. But that being said, I just kind of think that, now so much about their company's success, their business success is about their presence in a digital realm, right? For that, I think design is differentiating. People are starting to understand that. But I would say some of the markets that I end up in where, design is a little bit less mature or well understood, like I see companies that don't value design as much or don't have a strong design presence.
Yeah, so Yuki, actually, I did want to ask you, you talked about the capabilities that a designer has and making full use of them. So maybe taking a step back, in modern product design, what do you see as the core capabilities that a designer needs to be able to bring to be able to do their job well?
I think the first one is just its intense focus on the end user and just being a ruthless champion of that. I say this because I kind of think of like product design, product management, engineering kind of coming in with very different considerations, right? And, the business counterparts too. And everyone's kind of thinking about a particular problem they're solving or a set of constraints that they're trying to manage. And so I really like to encourage product designers to say, hey, like, ignore some of those constraints for a second. Maybe they're business constraints, maybe they're technical constraints. Just really put on the hat of a user, like what would make their lives better? How do you solve their problems better for them? And take that extreme perspective. But maybe someone like a product manager can like actually absorb that and kind of think about all the trade-offs together. That's kind of the first thing I ask of a product designer.
It's funny, we have multiple times on the show, under the guise of many different topics, talked about that idea of having a product vision, setting aside constraints, designing the ideal, and then working backwards with thin slices to get from here to there. It's great and reinforcing that that's what you're looking for a product designer to do as well, is set some of those constraints aside and think about the user first and figure out what they need.
And one of the things I've learned from that is, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of amazing product designers, some of whom we work together with Chris at Uber, but in asking them to take that kind of stance, sometimes they come up with stuff that actually inspires engineering to push themselves to figure out how to remove some of the constraints that they assumed
That's
in the
right.
first place. And so it's just
That's
like,
right.
I actually think a product designer has the capacity to inspire others to push past some of these constraints that they assume exist.
Yeah, I always get a little bit frustrated when a more junior product designer will say to me, but can engineering do that? or are we allowed to do that? And I'll be like, dude, let engineering figure out engineering. Just figure out what is the ideal. How should this thing work? Let's start
Right.
there. And so, yeah, a lot of people
Right.
pre-compromise their ideas.
Let me challenge something, Yuki, just because I think this is an interesting one. I've spoken to a lot of different people in different functions, and there are a lot of functions that like to claim the title of being the voice of the customer, right? You have product design, UX research, product managers that often say they're the voice of the customer. I've heard marketers claim they are the voice of the customer or the user. And I guess the interesting thing I'd really like to sort of dive into there is when you see this working well and you talk about product design, advocating for the customer, how does that fit into the broader scheme of building a great product?
I think a lot of people could have a claim to being the voice of the customer. And ideally, everyone's thinking about the customer, right? And it's not
Hmm.
unique to design. And I think a couple of things. One is maybe I would not use the phrase voice of the customer in the sense of I want designers to be completely obsessed about the customer and thinking about them. But that could be, something that customers aren't asking for today, right?
Mm.
And yet you're still able to put yourself in the shoes of a human being and imagining what their experience might be like. So I think voice of customer kind of supposes that there's already something that they're saying. And it's like, that's not what I'm necessarily asking design to represent. Like that should be an input, right? But it's really about kind of imagining what a different future potentially for that customer, but still like imagining it through their point of view. So that's kind of the first little nuance maybe. And then I think the second one is like, I think of design as uniquely being able to just focus on that as opposed to maybe a product manager has to take that as an input, but also there's these other business goals and other constraints and like they're trying to balance all those things. So I think it's hard sitting as a product manager to just be like singularly focused. Whereas I think design is a function that like you're given the charter to be more singularly focused.
Yeah, I like that actually, because one of the things we wanted to talk about was, what are the boundary conditions between product design and product management, and how do we think about those two roles interacting with each other? I think you alluded to this already, which is that product design is almost in this privileged place, if they're doing it right, to set some of the constraints and requirements aside and be more inspirational, aspirational, problem solving, and think through some of those ideal cases. And they're an incredibly important, I would say, almost prime mover in input for product managers. But then the role of product management is to temper that or fuse that or triangulate that with other considerations, engineering and sales and regulation and so on and so forth. And so often the mistake you'll see, particularly outside of Silicon Valley, is you'll have a non-technical founder or founder who's had very little experience in startups. They feel like, I need a CTO. I'm having problems, and what I need is a CTO. And of course, that CTO is just building stuff. The analogy I use often is like they're like a plumber or a carpenter on site at a job, and they're just like, I want a wall there. And like, sure, sir, I'll just slap up a wall there, right? And then what they're often missing is some taste and judgment and, storytelling about what this house is going to be. And then often they'll go then straight to design. They go, we need a designer because the designer can design the pretty pictures, right? But there's still that gap in the middle of the product manager who has to fuse what do the pixels say and what are the problems you're trying to solve. But you have to talk about sequencing and prioritization and product marketing and all of the other stuff that a product manager needs to combine together. So really, in an ideal world, you're having at least those people involved, or at least someone with a good eye to many of those skills, right?
I think that first of all, when you think about the division of labor between these functions, like I'm one to believe that a lot of the boundaries are more blurred than, we like to think, right? I myself, I was a product manager, but I also dabbled on the design side. And I kind of think that these disciplines are converging more and more, especially as engineering, design, and PM are being more de-obfuscated, right? Designers can code, engineers can design, all that kind of stuff. So I don't necessarily think there's one way to do things or one role or one kind of function to start with, just because, everyone has these unique skill sets and we should just kind of lean into that. So that's kind of a philosophy I have. But that being said, I think that, when push comes to shove, when it comes to responsibilities, I think about, the product manager being really responsible for the why. Like, why are we doing this? Why is this the most important problem? Why is this the most compelling solution? And getting people rallied around that. And that's what they uniquely own. Whereas, we talked about what product designers own, which is kind of this customer centricity.
Yuki, actually, I did want to circle back. You mentioned the unique skill sets that everyone brings to bear. And I asked you about this before, but I do want to come back to it. And I want to tell you why. The most common anti-pattern I see by far, and this includes actually many organizations that use Figma, is that the product designer is effectively relegated to the role of visual designer. So the product manager is responsible for the actual design. They won't use that word, but they will tell the product designer what to do. It's like, here are some screens, figure out where the buttons go and whatnot. And many product designers who've never worked at an organization where design is fully empowered actually accept that role as being effectively the visual designers who make it look good and maybe, focus on designing some of the micro interactions, but not designing the broader system. And so the question comes to me is, when you think about what is the skill set that a designer who is fully empowered in the way that you speak of has, what are those skills? What does the background of a designer like that actually look like?
I think that, first of all, this is changing. And then this is changing because I think what's happening with the design function is kind of similar to what's been happening to engineering, which is that designers are moving up the stack, if you will. And by that, I mean that, designers are no longer having to spend as much time on what traditionally we might have called production work or, execution work to get this to look just right, or, the visual design, because, there's already pre-existing components that your company has made. And a lot of design is about assembling these building blocks that exist and tweaking them and really focusing on like slightly bigger problem of like thinking through the end-to-end experience, thinking through the flow. And so I think first there's like this recognition that the skill sets have changed just because the nature of the job has changed itself. I think the best designers will kind of look at a problem and be able to first develop like a rough solution space and to say, hey, like there might be 4 general ways we might approach this problem, and be able to sketch out kind of something that is indicative of that direction or, evocative enough so that it can kind of encourage debate. And I think some of the best designers can do that so that we can kind of iterate and continue to have those conversations while looking more expansively at all the options. That's kind of the first thing. And then I think the second thing goes back to the customer centricity, which is the storytelling and, telling it through the customer's journey. Like, how do you actually stitch together like a solution experience that feels cohesive from the lens of a user? That's something that like designers are uniquely good at. And when I look at some of the best designers that I've worked with, they come from storytelling backgrounds. One of the best designers I ever worked with came from a film background, and another one came from an animation background. And I'm actually not surprised because, some of what you have to do is like tell this continuous story that, you can track and make sense and evoke some kind of emotion. And, those are some things that like designers are uniquely good at and skill sets that I definitely value.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
Yuki, I want to get really, really tactical for a minute, because some people listening may just be like, okay, but what are the building blocks of design? Like, what is the designer playing with in terms of raw materials? And what am I thinking about when I'm thinking about the design of my product? And I want to just make this like really boring and practical. There are a few key examples that spring to mind immediately. There's, for example, the UX metaphors of your app. So when you're thinking about a job to be done, a journey you want to take the user on, a designer is often thinking about like, hey, what's the right metaphor for this screen? Like, is it a list of items? Is it little cards in a feed? Is it a carousel? Is it a map? This is like really just boring, straightforward choices that a designer is making, right? They're often thinking about the states of the app, right? What does it look like when the screen is loading? What does it look like when the screen has no items in it yet? What does it look like when there's only one item? What does it look like when there's an error or when the form is half filled out? What does it look like when the user's transitioning from screen to screen or state to state? And what are the animations? And I remember at Uber realizing just the power of animation to help users go on a little cognitive journey, a connective journey from here to there, and tell a little story about where this thing went, right? Like, and what's happening, even as they swipe. And again, I'll give you just mad props for this, you and the design team at Uber. They're just the beautiful work that was done there. Another thing that's often really overlooked, and I'd love to see if you disagree with me on this, I feel like copywriting is like 50% of design, where people will often overlook the name on, or the label on a button or on a list and or the vocabulary being used. And I feel like, no, if the terminology is not right, then that narrative, that cognitive journey that the user's going on is broken. And it is absolutely not just about the metaphors and states and transitions. It's also about the words. And
Right.
so I'd love to get your thoughts on some or all of those building blocks.
Yeah. Now, I think those are all good building blocks. And to me, it's just a question of where do you start? And so for me, like I kind of would want a designer start at the journey level, which is essentially just these, I think of it as kind of what you would expect when you look at an animation, like frames of what's happening, what the user's seeing. I think there's a framework around like think, do, feel, like what am I thinking? What am I doing? What am I feeling? And maybe what I'm seeing. But in any case, kind of like enumerating all of that and in a pretty like low fidelity way. It could just be like a nominal, like a directional sketch, just so that we get on like the same page around what is the actual literal journey that a user is going through, right? And let's start with the happy path. And once we agree on the happy path, we can figure out all the states and error states and stuff like that that you were just talking about. So I kind of start there, right? And then it starts to become, okay, well, how do you convey that in a visual way? One of the areas that I push on and I'm really passionate about is information architecture. Like, where do all these different pieces go and how should they be organized and how should they align to a user's mental model? And that informs a lot of the journey as well, because you would have a lot of debates about, okay, well, we're talking about this journey, but oftentimes you already are attacking on a journey to another journey. So you need to figure out, okay, like where does this secondary journey even start? How is it discovered? And as part of that, you start to figure out, okay, well, how does navigation work? How are things organized? Is it intuitive? And then it starts to then kind of break down more into some of the pieces that you're talking about, which is like choices around, is this a button? Is this this kind of control? All those kinds of things, which hopefully you're just drawing from an existing system and you're not reinventing the wheel all the time on, right? But like, I think there's just kind of a way in which you kind of have to start with a journey. After that, you kind of think about the user mental model of like how things are organized. And then you can get to some of like the higher fidelity things you're talking about, which is those visual controls, how motion comes into the picture, et cetera. And I think back to Uber as being a really fantastic environment to learn that because so much happens off screen. I remember I was working with one of my closest friends, Ro Cervetti, who was working on Uber Pool at the time. And we were trying to get people to like walk to like a main avenue in New York so that we could emulate bus shuttles so that, we don't have Uber pools running around all over the place and just kind of going up and down avenues. And you're just kind of like, okay, how do you get a human being to actually like walk from where they are to somewhere else at the right time? Maybe under certain conditions. Maybe it's like snowing. Maybe it's, the middle of the night and it's scary. And it's just like so much of your journey actually ends up that you have to describe happens outside, right? And you're like, well, what do I even have to get a user set up for success, right? Like, do I send them notifications? Do I have to have this very clear visual like earlier so that they know and remember where to go? Or like, I think that's why the journey part is so important. Like, I think it's not just about the screens, it's kind of like one more like abstraction higher than that.
I actually had an interesting follow-up on that, Yuki, because I think our core listener base is relatively early stage founders here. And in a previous episode, Chris, you and I talked about the fact that really the first product manager is the founder, right? And the time to hire a real product manager as opposed to a project manager is usually later than you would expect. I think that was our episode with John Cutler. And something just occurred to me that I'd love your take on, Yuki, which is that if the role of the designer is broad, as we've discussed it, if it is really about the whole journey, at an early stage startup, doesn't it make sense that it's really the founder who is the product designer as well as the product manager for longer than you would expect? before you hire someone who becomes the person who knows the customer best, who is not the CEO.
I definitely feel that way for PMs and agree with you there, which is that like CEO is the PM. And if you're delegating it to PM so early, I would question that to some extent. As it relates to designer, I think we just have to recognize that not all founders have these skill sets, first of all. And second of all, it's kind of related to how it can actually be hard to PM and design at the same time. And I've seen this struggle. I am recalling, someone that I worked with once who wanted to try this hybrid role, and we let them do that. And I saw them struggle a little bit because you start to take shortcuts and you're like, well, I think I know this constraint, so I'm going to like declare it up front so that I don't kind of explore this whole branch in the solution space. Or I don't let myself dream a little bit of what's possible because I already have a good sense of the trade-offs. And so this doesn't make sense up front. And so you start to get very narrowed in very quickly. And I kind of see a CEO as oftentimes sitting and taking in all these different inputs and figuring out what to do. And so I find it really hard to think that you can do that and design what's possible in the future. But I'm sure there are a lot of special human beings who can do that. And there's a lot of designer founders too, and they're successful. But I think they might be successful because they're surrounded by people who can take on those other roles.
There's two things there I really enthusiastically agree with. The first is it really does depend on the skills of the founder. There are many domain expert founders or founders who come from a very different world than tech who are very, very bad at product management. They just do not know how to translate their ideas into product in any way, shape, or form, much less design. Like design is even a harder craft, I think. And so there are many inexperienced founders who just need a product manager. They need someone around them who has some kind of taste, judgment, craft around that. They understand how software works. I think it's especially true also for design. And it's more often true for design because design is even more often a foreign language. But you also said it's difficult to be successful as both the product manager and the designer. And on the podcast, I'm on the record multiple times saying it's also very, very difficult to be both an engineer and a product manager on the same product as well, to basically be an engineer making all the product decisions. It's also very difficult, I think, to be a CEO who has to sell and make decisions about the product, because you make a lot of compromises in the meeting to sell the deal, and then you end up pancaking or corrupting the product strategy. And you have this kind of tendency to say yes in the meeting where product management needs you to say no. And so between all of these functions, in the ideal, when the team gets a little bit bigger, having discrete people being product, eng, design, sales, and CEO, I think the quicker you can get to that, I mean, there's this kind of school of thought where it's like, hey, the CEO and the founder should be the product manager for as long as possible. And I don't think that's true. I think they should be product managing for as long as necessary, and as long as necessary to get product market fit, perhaps. But I think there is this really important, healthy, creative tension that needs to be injected into the system relatively early on, or you end up with these kind of bizarre unintended consequences. What do you reckon? Is that crazy?
No, I don't think it's crazy. I think the way I kind of think about it in my head is I don't actually care about people's titles, right? It's like there are certain considerations that need to be made, and it's healthy when different people are focused on those different considerations. As a human being, it's hard to like pivot between these, points of view often, even though some people, you can create processes to force you to do that. So yeah, I mean, and it's very well possible that maybe the engineer is taking on this point of view and the CEO is taking on this other point of view. I'm less about like the roles than rather like kind of the jobs to be done within a company of like which perspectives need to be taken.
I think that's valid pushback. Just to wrap up my thoughts on this, I think what it does mean is that as a product designer number one at an early stage startup, your relationship with the CEO needs to be very, very tight, because ultimately, Yuhki, you said it's the job of the product designer to know the customer better than anybody else. But I think at the very early stage, that is really the CEO's job. They are the visionary. They have started this thing. And so in order to be able to come up with a design that utilizes the designer's skills while still having the input and the approval of the CEO and the understanding and insight of the CEO requires a really high bandwidth relationship. And I think, again, it's so easy to just end up in a situation where the designer is involved too late in the process, once the CEO has already figured out what the journey should look like, and then just applying those skills much more narrowly in the way I described, basically saying this is how we make your journey look nice and have the right micro interactions, but not think about the overall journey.
I think one thing that I'll add is a healthy kind of relationship you can have between two individuals like that is one person's the generator, one person's the synthesizer. And by that, I kind of mean that like one person's just like coming up with all these crazy ideas and like, just like trying to move the conversation along or inspire others to think bigger. And then the other person's taking that and like synthesizing that into a point of view. And typically speaking, I would say like designers are maybe the generators and PMs are the synthesizers, but that's not always the case, right? Like, you could definitely have like a founder who just has a ton of different ideas and taking the company in all sorts of different directions. And you need like a designer who can like distill that into something that is a cohesive experience for a customer, or maybe a product manager who can kind of like prioritize that. But I think those are the dynamics that are the fundamental building block of a really healthy creative relationship. And, every founder is different, every designer is different, but that's kind of what I, aspire to emulate at different levels.
Yuhki, we recently published an episode about Agile versus Waterfall. And we talked about the limits of Agile. With undisciplined teams, with inexperienced teams, it risks this kind of iteration to nowhere, where you kind of like incrementally just responding to customer feedback or the next great idea, but it's not laddering up to some meaningful customer journey, delivery of value, product market fit, and so on. I'm curious what you think about that. And one of the prescriptions we talked about was thinking about this ideal product design, setting aside constraints, technical constraints, regulatory constraints, and just spending some time thinking about where is this all going. I'm curious if those things connect for you, how much time you would spend doing something like that, and what time horizon would you be thinking about in the terms of this ideal design? Is it a design that's going to be where you might be in 12 months or 24 months, or is it in 2 weeks, 3 weeks? So how do you think about this idealized strategic design process, maybe we call it?
It's a good question. And I think it's kind of this age-old question around like, what is your cadence of operation in a sense, And I think the biggest insight is you just need to be deliberate about having two different cadences, one that's kind of like major and one that's kind of minor. And there is a lot of goodness to that kind of like this ethos of the Agile method, which is like, okay, let's get something out there, iterate, make it better and learn versus like end up in a conference room for months and months and not figure something out, right? At the same time, to your point, if that just results in local maximizing, that's not great, or local hill climbing. And so there needs to be these like moments where you zoom out and think about it. And so, recently I was giving a talk at our user conference Config with my mentor Shashir, who's the CEO of Coda, who I knew from YouTube way back when too. And we set off and studied a bunch of different companies and how they executed, how they planned. And one example that came up was the New York Times, where, actually every day they're shipping a product, which is the daily news. But then also they do quarterly planning, but they also have like 3-year, 5-year, 10-year visions as well. When you think about kind of the transformation of a company like that. And so I think you just have to be deliberate about like saying there's two cadences that you're managing. And then each company is really different. Like it can be really entirely silly to be thinking about like a year or 3 years from now when you found zero product market fit and you just need to kind of like get some stuff out there and learn. On the other hand, like you could kind of err on the opposite and just get so bogged down by what sales is telling you or like what your customers are telling you and don't give yourself the breathing room. I don't think there's magic numbers. I think it's very specific to like where you are. But if you can have this idea of like minor and major planning, you can be more deliberate about when you give yourself the space to think bigger and when you just say, hey, like we just need to be in execution mode.
I keep thinking about and coming back to the sort of nexus between product designers and product managers and engineers. And, sometimes this is called the triad or the stool. And I think a lot of these problems go away, or these potential problems go away, if you have an effective working relationship between those three. Because I think you want designers to both be idealistic. You want them to come up with that ideal product design, that vision at the beginning that you talked about, from understanding users best. And that should be their role. But also, you want them to be pragmatic, right? Because in the end, you don't want them to pre-compromise that vision based on what they think engineering can or can't do, or based on commercial constraints. But then those constraints need to be layered in, right? And then you have that iterative process where you want to take that design and with product management, with engineering, iterate on it and make the right sets of compromises. So I actually think when we talk about whether it's agile or some other way of thinking, is the important thing is you don't have a linear process where design hands off to product management, hands off to engineering, or even more commonly, product management hands over to design, hands over to engineering. And you don't have any of those feedback loops and iterations where you actually work together as a team to produce the best set of compromises and the right outcome based on your vision, your understanding of your users and customers, and your resource and technical constraints that exist, that will always exist in any product.
I think that's right. Just to add even more to that non-linearity, I actually think as much as we love to like theorize on how products actually get built, the reality, where we say, hey, we're going to define this problem and then we're going to go through these steps to get to the right solution. The reality of what happens in a lot of startups and companies and even great companies is that you actually start with an idea, a solution. Someone like has a particular vision, and then you have to kind of like unpack that and say, okay, is that solving the best problem? Maybe not. Let's talk about other things. Or is that the best solution for that problem? Or can we, improve upon that execution? I'm sure, Chris, like you can think of times when, even at Uber where there's just an idea. It wasn't like we started with a blank slate of like, we have this problem and we need to like imagine a solution from there. Someone already has an idea of a solution. It could be an engineer, it could be anyone. So I just want to also want to recognize that there is that reality, and I want to normalize that a little bit more and to say it's important to like work backwards from there and define the right problem, because so that you're all aligned on like the right goals, but not kind of over idolize this particular way of working, which may not always result in the best solutions. And that's one of the biggest things that I learned in startup world too, where our CEO Dylan would always kind of come with an idea like, let's build feature X, and I'd be like, okay, but like, why? Like, can we talk about the problem first? And like, we do all of that. But I think, sometimes like the biggest lessons I've kind of learned is like, you don't actually get credit in your users' eyes for defining the right problems. And like, a mediocre solution to the right problem is maybe worse than like the right solution to a smaller problem, for example. And so I think there's just something about it. And I'm not sure if it's totally relevant to what you're saying, but like, I just wanted to throw out there, when I heard the kind of term linear and nonlinear.
I think that's really great.
Yeah, we talk a lot on the podcast about the tendency for people, both inside and outside of Silicon Valley, especially outside of Silicon Valley, to experience this delta between what they've read on the blogs and the podcasts and the books, the academic kind of purist ideal view of how these things are done, versus the pragmatic reality of how these things are done. You talked about the problem first, religion. There are other religions we've tackled here, like testing everything. Well, we got to test this before we ship it. And it's like, what is our hypothesis and and I'm like, hey guys, the wizard doesn't have a bloody next button. And it's like, but we should test that. It's like, you don't need to test that. You just need to add a next button. We talk about the overuse of the term MVP, where people just don't understand what it means, but they read it on a blog or they read it in the book, and all of these PMs or these founders are running around using the vocabulary, but haven't deeply internalized where those terms come from, what they really mean, and the reality that sometimes it just doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. Our friend of the pod, John Cutler, talks about the beautiful mess and how all of these principles and truisms all have exceptions. They're all case specific. They're all been invented by someone just trying to solve a problem. Someone wrote it down really eloquently in a book, and it propagated, and a lot of people digested it and started doing it without truly understanding the sponsoring thoughts behind it. Hopefully, if people listening to our show will get best practices, they'll get common patterns and anti-patterns, but they'll also get the sense that, hey, there's also just a pragmatic reality that you got to kind of get your nose at the grindstone and execute and get shit done. Yuhki, this has been just tons of fun, both very pragmatic and also kind of a bit philosophical and all expansive. Thank you for going on the journey with us. Obviously everyone should go race out and use Figma, and if you're not already, what the hell are you doing? You're living under a rock. But is there any other way they can follow your work, follow your thoughts, and follow you on the internet?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. Super fun. Not sure I'm a huge social person, but, here and there, I drop stuff in LinkedIn, and, I have a Figma community file where sometimes when I do my own designs, I post stuff there or my talks. So find me there. And I'm always really excited to hear kind of how people are using Figma, what feedback they have for us. So yeah, don't be shy.
Of course, we use it every week for our thumbnails and all our design stuff. And I've often said to people, if I didn't do my advisory work, I would just love to live in Figma all day as a designer. It's just my favorite thing to do. I've loved design my whole life, but Figma made it like a pure joy.
Hey, Chris, are Figma paying us to say all this stuff?
Absolutely not.
It's
Although,
free.
let's talk.
That's how cheap we are, folks. No, it's a fantastic tool. I love Figma as well.
Yeah, I mean, it is literally the gold standard for developing products. So, Yaniv, how can people find you on the internet?
I'm mostly on LinkedIn, trying to make it a little bit less boring, so you can find me. I'm the only Yaniv Bernstein on there, and I love getting connection requests from TSP listeners. So if you're a listener, just let me know in the request, and I'll accept it.
And of course, you can find me at chrissaad.com and on LinkedIn and all the social media at chrissaad. All right, guys, great conversation.
Thank you.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.